The fields stretched endlessly under a gray sky, the soil scarred by recent rains, and the heavy footprints of men who no longer tilled but patrolled. Once this land was nothing more than wheat and corn, rows of vegetables and barns full of hay. Now, fences were reinforced with steel, farmhouses turned into watchtowers, and the very earth seemed to bleed under the weight of conflict. Jacob, who had inherited the farm from generations of his family, stood with calloused hands gripping a plow handle that had been reforged into a spear. He never imagined the ground he had planted seeds into would one day drink in blood. The invaders had come swift and merciless, their machines roaring across the horizon, demanding resources that farmers like Jacob's people had never thought of as valuable. The minerals beneath the soil, the clean rivers that irrigated crops, the vast open fields, these were the prizes they wanted. But to the villagers, this land was more than resource. It was memory, livelihood, and identity. And when one woman rose among them, with eyes like molten steel and a voice that rang with conviction, they saw in her something greater than survival. They saw defiance made flesh. Her name was Illyra, an alien princess exiled from her own fractured world who had stumbled wounded into Jacob's barn weeks before the war began. At first, the farmers saw her as an omen, cloaked in strangeness, silver hair like threads of moonlight, skin shimmering faintly in the torchlight, and a gaze that held both pain and unyielding hope. But when the invaders marched upon the farm, it was Illyra who stood on the porch unafraid and declared the soil beneath her feet sacred. She spoke not as a fugitive, but as a leader, claiming the right to fight beside those who gave her shelter. The first skirmish came at dawn. Jacob remembered the sound before anything else. The clatter of armored boots approaching through the mist, the growl of engines. Farmers gathered with scythes, pitchforks, and whatever rifles remained from old wars. Against trained soldiers, they seemed pitifully unprepared. Yet Illyra moved among them like a beacon, her hands tracing patterns. In the air that stirred winds through the crops, her words weaving courage into their chests. "This is no longer just a farm," she told them. "This is a ground where they will learn the meaning of resistance." And with that, the battle began. The clash was brutal. Fire tore across the wheat fields, consuming the season's harvest. In minutes, and bullets shredded the scarecrows that once guarded against birds. Jacob fought with a fury he did not know he had, his plow spear driving into the chest plate of an armored foe. Beside him, Illyra fought with elegance, wielding no weapon but her hands, which glowed with strange energy that bent steel and shattered rifles. When one soldier leveled a cannon toward the farmhouse, she raised her palm, and the blast rebounded into the sky, scattering like fireworks across the clouds. When the smoke cleared, the field was a graveyard of ash and twisted machines. The farmers, bruised and bloodied, stood dazed among the ruins of their own livelihood. Crops were gone, barns collapsed, and the air still reeked of gunpowder. But the invaders had fled. Jacob, panting and trembling, turned to Illyra. She knelt in the dirt, pressing her hand to the scorched soil. "It still breathes," she whispered. "So long as the earth still breathes, it can be reborn. And so can we." In the nights that followed, the farm became more than land. It became fortress. Fences were lined with traps, irrigation ditches repurposed into trenches, and every villager found themselves under Illyra's guidance. She taught them discipline, strategy, and above all, belief. Her voice carried in the night when doubts grew. Heavy. "You are farmers, yes, but that makes you stronger than they know. You know patience. You know the soil. You know what it means to give life with your hands. That is the greatest strength of all." And against all reason, hope bloomed. Jacob often found himself studying her in the firelight when the others slept. She was unlike anything he had ever known. Her beauty almost unbearable, her scars a reminder of battles older than his world. Yet what struck him most was her resolve, her refusal to bend even when loss surrounded her. In her presence, the farm no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like sacred ground, protected not just by fences or weapons, but by her unshakable spirit. And Jacob realized that this war had bound them together, not by chance, but by something greater. Fate sown deep into the soil itself. The invaders did not forget their defeat. They returned, not in handfuls, but in legions, metallic beasts. The size of barns stomped across the fields, firing beams that turned furrows into glass. Villagers screamed, scattering into trenches as the earth itself seemed to crack under the weight of war. Jacob found himself at the heart of it, shouting orders with a confidence he had never known, while Elira climbed atop the barn roof, her figure lit against the smoke-choked sky. With arms spread wide, she drew the energy from the very land, summoning a shield that shimmered over the farmhouse. The shield held, but not without cost. Every surge of energy seemed to weaken her, her breaths coming shallow and her body trembling. Jacob wanted to pull her down, to beg her to stop, but her eyes locked with his and silenced him. "This is what I was born for," she said, her voice cracking but unbroken. "And I will not fail." The words struck Jacob deeper than any blade, for he realized she wasn't just fighting for her survival anymore. She was fighting for his people, his land, and the memory of every seed planted in that soil. By dawn, the battlefield was silent once again. The farm was wreckage, fences torn apart, fields blackened, and homes reduced to rubble. Yet not a single invader remained standing. Farmers stumbled from trenches, their bodies battered, but their spirits burning brighter than ever. They had won again. Not because of numbers, but because Elira refused to let the land fall. Standing at the center of the devastation, she raised her hand, her silver hair falling over her face, and whispered words that Jacob knew would never leave him. "This farm is not just soil. It is sacred because it holds us together." It was then Jacob understood something profound. The farm had been his inheritance, a burden passed down by blood. But under Elira's guidance, it had transformed into something timeless, larger than any family name or lineage. It had become a symbol of resistance, of courage, and of unshakable unity. And as the smoke lifted and the first rays of sun touched the blackened earth, Jacob knew that so long as Elira stood with them, the farm would never truly fall. The next weeks blurred into endless preparation. The fields that once sang with wind over wheat were now scarred with trenches and barricades of overturned wagons. Every villager worked by day and drilled by night, their hands blistered from shovels as much as weapons. Jacob, once a quiet farmer, now spoke with the voice of command. His orders steady, his eyes sharp. Yet all of it still centered on her, Elira. She was the pillar they leaned upon, her every word transforming despair into grit. The farm had become a citadel, and its people an army. But war is not only fought from without. Doubts spread like rot within the barn walls where they slept. Some villagers whispered that Elira's power drained the land itself, that her shimmering hands stole the lifeblood from the soil. Jacob overheard it one evening, two men muttering near the well, their faces twisted with suspicion. "She's no savior," one spat. "Look at the fields, blackened, withered. This is her curse, not our salvation." Though Jacob's fists tightened, he said nothing. He knew suspicion could destroy them faster than enemy blades. The rumors festered until betrayal came like a knife in the dark. One night, as the villagers huddled in the barn, a group of men opened the southern gate and waved a flare high into the sky. Within minutes, engines thundered beyond the tree line. The invaders had been waiting. Shouts erupted and chaos tore through the farmhouse yard. Villagers scrambled for weapons, mothers dragged children into the cellars, and Jacob found himself locked in combat with one of his own, a neighbor whose eyes burned with desperate madness. Elira arrived at the heart of the battle like a storm. Her hands glowed, casting arcs of light that blinded the traitors and sent invaders reeling. She moved with such fury that even Jacob, bloodied and breathless, paused in awe. Yet, the betrayal cut deeper than any sword. When the dust settled and the traitors lay bound, the village was fractured. Friends no longer trusted one another, and fear poisoned the air. Elira knelt in the center of the yard, her silver hair damp with sweat, her voice hoarse but firm. If we fracture, we fall. If we stand together, this land will never bow. Despite her words, Jacob saw how the doubt lingered. He found her later that night, sitting by the scorched remains of the barn, her gaze fixed on the earth. "They fear me," she whispered, "and perhaps they are right too." Jacob crouched beside her, touching the soil with his rough hands. "Fear doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is what we choose, and I choose to stand with you." For a moment, the warrior princess and the farmer shared silence beneath the stars, bound not by blood, but by a promise neither dared speak aloud. The next day, while reinforcing the trenches, Jacob's spade struck something hard. At first he thought it a stone, but as he dug, smooth lines and patterns emerged, etched metal, buried deep beneath the farmland. Word spread quickly, and soon Elira stood beside him, her eyes wide with recognition. "This is no relic of your people," she breathed. "It is ancient, older than your wars, older than even my exile." With careful effort, they unearthed a fragment of what seemed to be a massive buried structure, glowing faintly with forgotten energy. Excavation revealed more. Crystalline panels, tunnels that hummed when touched, symbols no farmer could read. Elira traced them with reverent fingers, her voice trembling. "This land was chosen long before your family planted seeds here. A fortress sleeps beneath your soil, a place my ancestors once swore to protect." The revelation shook the villagers. The farm was no longer just land. It was a battlefield, layered upon an ancient stronghold, their destiny entwined with secrets older than history itself. The discovery drew the invaders like vultures. They came at night, cloaked in silence, their blades glinting under starlight. Jacob was shaken from sleep by the alarm of a horn, racing to the trenches with a rifle in hand. Shadows surged from the tree line, overwhelming their defenses. Fire arrows streaked across the night, igniting the haystacks. Elira stood at the buried entrance of the structure, refusing to retreat even as bullets whistled past her. "They cannot have this place," she cried, her voice rising above the chaos. Jacob fought with ferocity he had never imagined possible, but the enemy's numbers seemed endless. For every one they struck down, 3 more emerged from the darkness. Villagers screamed, some cut. Down in their own fields, others dragged away into the night. Jacob's arms ached, his breath burned, but still he swung. Still he fought, and then he saw her. Elira, standing at the threshold of the uncovered chamber, her body glowing with power she could barely contain. With a cry that shook the heavens, Elira unleashed her strength. Light surged from her hands into the buried fortress, awakening it. The ground quaked, the very air vibrated, and a shimmering dome of energy erupted across the farm. Invaders were thrown back, their machines fried, their weapons rendered useless. For a moment, silence fell, a silence filled with awe and terror. The farmers, bruised and bloodied, looked upon their land transformed, now shielded by forces far beyond mortal understanding. When dawn came, the survivors gathered at the heart of the farm. Smoke still rose from burnt barns, blood stained the furrows. But their eyes were fixed on Elira. She stood at the edge of the glowing dome, her face pale from exhaustion, yet her gaze steady. "This ground is sacred," she said. It was chosen long before us. We are its guardians now. And so long as we fight together, no army will ever take it." Jacob stepped forward, his chest heaving from the night's battle. He looked around at the battered faces of his people, men and women who had once only worried about harvests and weather, and realized they had become something more. They were warriors, bound not by blood or nation, but by the soil itself, and Elira, the alien princess, was their heart. But Jacob also knew the war was far from over. The invaders would return, angrier and stronger. The betrayal within their ranks had proven that fear could gnaw at them as deeply as any enemy blade, and now, with the fortress awakened, they stood at the edge of something greater than they understood. He clenched his fists and looked to Elira. "If they want war," he said, his voice steady, "then we'll give them one they'll never forget." Elira met his gaze, her lips curving into a faint, weary smile. "Yes," she replied, "but remember, Jacob, the farm is not just where the war ends. It is where something new begins." The villagers, hearing her words, raised their weapons skyward. For the first time, they did not see themselves as farmers defending scraps of land. They saw themselves as guardians of something ancient and eternal. And in that moment, the farm, though scarred and blood-stained, truly became sacred ground. The days after the night raid were strangely quiet. Smoke drifted across the charred fields, the smell of ash clinging to every breath. The villagers patched wounds, buried their dead, and whispered prayers in the ruins of the barn. Yet beneath the grief simmered a steel resolve. They would not surrender. Elira moved among them like a spectral flame, pale but unyielding. Wherever she walked, weary heads lifted, and tired hands returned to work. Jacob noticed it most of all. The way even hardened men straightened at her passing, as though her presence alone commanded courage. But he also saw the toll. Her hands trembled after every surge of power, her steps slower than before. She had poured too much of herself into awakening the buried fortress, and the fortress seemed hungry for more. At night, Jacob would hear its low hum beneath the soil, like a beast stirring in its sleep. The invaders, however, were not idle. Scouts reported vast columns gathering at the horizon, armored vehicles, war beasts shackled in chains, soldiers, bearing banners black as pitch. They were not coming to raid or test, they were coming to finish it. The farm, once a patch of earth barely noticed by the outside world, had become the keystone of the war. Whoever controlled it would control the fortress sleeping below. One council night, as the villagers argued, a sharp debate cut through the smoky air. "We can't win this," shouted one man. "We're farmers, not soldiers," another retorted. "Then would you rather lie down and let them take everything?" Elira raised her hand, silencing them. "This land has chosen us," she said softly but firmly. "I cannot explain why, but I know this. We are not defending soil. We are defending the very balance of worlds." Her words struck like hammers. Even those who doubted before found themselves nodding, their fear reshaped into a fiercer purpose. On the eve of battle, Jacob patrolled the trenches. The fields glistened under moonlight, broken stalks swaying in the wind. He passed families, holding each other tight, children clutching crude weapons too large for their hands. He thought of what this place had once been: laughter in the fields, the smell of bread baking, calves bawling in the morning. Now it was all sharpened into war. And yet, as he walked, Elira joined him, her silver hair shimmering faintly. She reached for his hand, and for a moment farmer and princess shared a silence that said more than words. The next dawn broke not with birdsong, but with the thunder of engines. The horizon boiled with smoke as the enemy advanced, an endless tide of armored war machines and foot soldiers marching in cruel rhythm. The earth shook with every step. Villagers lined the barricades, their hands white-knuckled around rifles and pitchforks alike. Jacob took his place at the front, rifle slung across his back, a farmer's axe gripped in hand. He looked to Elira, who stood upon the mound above the trenches. She was radiant, her presence a beacon even against the storm. Rolling toward them, the first clash was like the sky itself breaking. Enemy artillery roared, tearing great chunks of earth, scattering men like straw. But the farmers held. They rose from trenches, unleashed volleys of fire, and countercharged with sharpened tools turned into weapons of war. Jacob was everywhere. At once, dragging wounded to safety, cutting down armored soldiers, shouting orders with a voice that carried over the chaos. It was no longer a farm boy who fought there. It was a leader born in blood and soil. Elira stood at the center, her body alight. Each gesture of her hands unleashed walls of shimmering force, deflecting missiles, tearing through ranks of enemies. Yet every burst of power drained her further. Jacob saw the sweat pouring down her brow, the strain twisting her features. The fortress beneath the ground seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, demanding, feeding, binding her more tightly with each surge. The invaders brought their greatest weapon then, a siege engine like a crawling mountain of steel, bristling, with cannons and spikes. It rolled over trenches, crushing men beneath its wheels. Panic rippled across the farmers' lines as the machine advanced inexorably. Jacob's axe glanced uselessly off its armor, bullets ricocheted like rain. For a heartbeat, despair threatened to undo them. And then Elira rose above the battlefield, carried aloft by the fortress's energy. Her voice echoed like thunder across the farm. "This land is ours. You will not take it." Her entire body became a conduit of radiant light. She thrust her hands toward the siege engine, and from the earth itself, jagged spears of energy erupted, impaling the behemoth. With a groan like a dying titan, it collapsed in flames, the explosion shaking. The skies. The farmers roared, hope rekindled. But the price was brutal. Elira fell, her body crumpling, the light flickering out. Jacob ran to her side, his hands trembling as he lifted her. Her eyes fluttered open, faintly glowing, her voice weak but resolute. "The fortress needs one. Last bond," she whispered. "It must be sealed with life. With mine." Jacob's heart cracked at her words. "No," he choked. "There has to be another way." But her smile was gentle, sorrowful. "This land will live because of us, because of you. Remember that." The final surge erupted as Elira pressed her palms into the soil. The fortress beneath awoke in full, releasing a dome of blazing energy that consumed the battlefield. The invaders screamed as their machines crumbled to ash, their armies scattered like leaves in a storm. When the light faded, silence reigned. The enemy was gone. The farm, though scarred, still stood. And Elira lay motionless in Jacob's arms, her beauty peaceful, her sacrifice complete. Days later, the survivors rebuilt what they could. The fortress still hummed beneath the soil, now sealed and bound by Elira's final act. No invader dared return. Farmers planted once more, though their fields bore the weight of memory heavier than any harvest. And Jacob, he stood as their chosen leader, not because he wanted it, but because no one else could bear the mantle. He carried Elira's memory with him always, her courage etched into the sacred ground they defended. Sometimes, at dusk, Jacob would walk the fields alone, listening to the faint hum beneath the soil. And though she was gone, he swore he could still feel her there, watching, guiding, reminding him that the farm was not just his inheritance. It was the battlefield where resolve turned ordinary people into legends, and thus the tale spread far, beyond the village, of a farm defended against impossible odds, of a princess whose sacrifice sanctified the soil, and of a farmer who became a commander. The farm was never just land again. It was sacred ground,